Depression, she told them. Nothing serious, just the weight of things. Her name was Velma Orlikow, wife of a Canadian Member of Parliament. Educated, trusted, she was certain she was in the right place. 86 days later, she woke up not knowing her own name, not due to illness, but because the man treating her had decided that erasing her identity was the first step to fixing it. And he was being paid by the United States government to do this. By 1950, the CIA had a problem that wouldn't go away. Reports from Korea suggested that captured American soldiers weren't just breaking under pressure, they were confessing to crimes they hadn't committed, praising systems that they despised, speaking in voices that just didn't sound like their own. The intelligence community had a word for it: menticide. And the question being asked inside Langley was brutally simple. Can you actually erase human beings and rewrite them from scratch? The program that they built to answer this question was called MKUltra. 80 institutions and 44 universities, 150 separate research projects, a multi-million-dollar project funded by the United States government to turn human beings into programmable hardware. And at the centre of it, a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Ewen Cameron, operating out of a converted Victorian mansion on the slopes of Mount Royal in Montreal. Cameron wasn't a fringe figure. He was the former president of the American Psychiatric Association. He had credentials that made other scientists refer to him in the room, and he had a theory that mental illness couldn't be treated, only demolished and rebuilt. He called Phase 1 Depatterning. Depatterning wasn't a metaphor, it was a step-by-step process for dismantling the human consciousness. Here's how it worked. Step 1, drugs. Cameron used cocktails of barbiturates, LSD, mescaline and paralytic agents to induce a sleep state so deep it was indistinguishable from a coma. Patients slept for 24 hours a day, some for weeks at a time. Velma Orlikow's records show she objected. When the injections began, her own words documented said, "I don't want these." Cameron administered them anyway. Her coma lasted 86 days. She described what the sessions felt like her bones were melting, like squirrels trapped in a cage. Those are her words, not a clinical note, not a medical summary. Velma Orlikow's own account of what government-funded scientists had decided was necessary for her recovery. Step 2, Electroshock. Standard ECT in 1957 delivered roughly 110 volts once or twice a week under anaesthesia. Cameron's version delivered 150 to 200 volts 2 to 3 times a day, and without anaesthesia in the early sessions, documented in his own clinical notes as necessary to achieve what he called regression, stripping the brain back to what he described as the mind of a young child. Subjects lost the ability to feed themselves, to control their own bodies. Several could no longer recognise their own children. One woman, a mother of 3, is recorded in Cameron's notes as achieving what he termed a complete depatterning. She couldn't speak, she couldn't stand, had to be retaught the alphabet. In Cameron's files, this was documented as progress. Phase 2 was called psychic driving. Once Cameron had depatterned a patient, once the mind was, in his words, blank and receptive, the reconstruction began. Patients were fitted with helmets lined with speakers. Messages recorded by Camden himself were looped onto tapes, and those tapes played 20 hours a day, sometimes longer. The messages were designed with precision. Some were negative, intended to destroy what Camden called pathological self-concepts. You have no value. You have always failed. No one needs you. Others were affirmations, a new identity, scripted and repeated until the brain had no competing memory to push back with. A single phrase could loop hundreds of thousands of times before Camden considered it embedded. Survivors described being unable to think around the sound, and that is from a documented testimony. A relentless, burrowing worm of a message. that replaced their own internal voice. Some would come out of the sessions repeating the message verbatim without even knowing they were doing it. And Cameron called this treatment. He wrote papers on it, presented it at conferences. He was celebrated. The CIA called it exactly what it was, a prototype for manufacturing loyalty from nothing. A Manchurian candidate, written over an erased human mind. Velma Orlikow wasn't alone. Charles Tanner walked into the Allan Memorial Institute with nerve pain. He came out unable to remember that he had a family. The images of his own children, the people he had raised, cared for and loved, returned nothing. What did stay was the metallic taste of Cameron's drug cocktails at the back of his throat. He spent the rest of his life trying to fill in the gaps that never fully closed. Meanwhile, across the border, the program was running a different kind of trial. At the Charles Street Jail in Boston, a 28-year-old serving time for truck hijacking volunteered for a government study. He was told it might reduce his sentence. His name was James Bulger. For 15 months, Bulger and 18 other inmates were administered LSD weekly, escalating doses. No therapeutic support. No psychiatric monitoring before or after the session. Bulger later described watching blood run down the walls of his cell, of seeing the faces of fellow inmates peeling back to the bone, of weeks where the line between hallucinations and reality had dissolved completely. It never left me, he wrote from a federal prison decades later, where he was serving 2 consecutive life sentences for murder. Whatever they put in me, it's still there. Whether the experiment shaped what James Whitey Bulger became, the CIA never asked. They just had what they needed from the data. In 1973, the CIA director ordered all the documents from the MKUltra trials destroyed. The evidence was gone. The survivors, many of them were returned to the world with nothing, no diagnosis they could trace of what had been done to them, no record that connected the damage to its cause. The Canadian government eventually offered $100,000 to those that came forward, with a non-disclosure agreement attached. No apology, no admission of guilt, no accountability for Cameron, who in 1967 had died of a heart attack while hiking in the Alps, never having answered a single question in a single courtroom. And Helms was thorough, almost. In 1977, a journalist filed a Freedom of Information Act request. Standard procedure, he expected nothing really useful. The CIA reviewed its archives and found approximately 20,000 documents that had survived the 1973 destruction order. Not because someone had protected them, not because a whistleblower had the courage to hold something back, but because a filing clerk had put them in the wrong cabinet. The destruction order that Helms had issued was specific to operational files. This batch had been misfiled under a financial records annex. A different room, almost certainly on a forgettable Tuesday afternoon by someone who went home and never thought about it again. Everything we know about MKUltra, every name, every patient, every institution, every crime committed with government funding exists because of that one misfiled folder. Not a hero, not a spy, not a whistleblower, bureaucratic mistake. The church committee hearings that followed were the first time the majority of the public had heard the name Donald Ewen Cameron. Velma Orlikow testified. When asked by the committee about her treatment at the Allan Memorial Institute, after 86 days of injection, she'd asked them to stop. After years waking in fragments, after trying to explain to people she loves what had happened to her, she said, "I really tried hard." Her granddaughter would later describe watching her summon, and these are her words, every bit of energy and courage just to walk out the door and face it. So did 9 other surviving subjects. Portions of Cameron's files remain classified to this day. MKUltra was officially terminated in 1973. The CIA stated publicly that no programs of this kind continued. The Senate was given assurances. The files gone. But consider what it took to find the ones that had remained. A misfiled folder, a Freedom of Information request, 20 years distance from events that no one was supposed to know had happened. The question is, what's in those correct cabinets? The next video about a dynasty so obsessed with keeping power behind its own bloodline that their own bodies began to fail under the weight of it. A jar that didn't close, children that wouldn't survive, an empire that rotted from the inside out, one generation at a time. The Habsburg curse, next time on Hairy History. I'm Carl. This is Hairy History. Please like and subscribe for more.